I have a half-brother named Oren who's almost 10 years older than me. Because of our age difference, he moved out when I was still young. Even still, we were very close up until then. His relationship with my parents was rough, to say the least, so I was really the only one in our family that he talked to. I remember from when I was really young that Oren got into trouble often. He was suspended from school many times. He came home drunk at least a few times, and other stuff like that. When I was 7 or 8 years old, Oren moved out for good. He worked in oil and gas for several years, and eventually bought a house in a remote spot in the mountains. He and I would talk weekly, but my parents would never let me go out to visit him. I think they were worried that he would be a bad influence on me. I thought that was nonsense, because he had really turned his life around. Being a homeowner at 25 is pretty impressive where I come from. He'd always been a bit of a loner, the type who'd rather spend time in nature and with animals than with other people. That's probably why he bought a place in the middle of nowhere as soon as he could afford to. He told me it was a small house, surrounded by a vast expanse of land. He had a garden, a few chickens, and a lifestyle that seemed very different than what I was used to. When I graduated from high school, I went to college in a town that was not far away from Oren's property, so after my first year, I planned to finally visit my brother. Up until then, we had only seen each other once or twice per year, and I had never been to his place. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. After a 3-hour drive from my town, my brother greeted me with a warm hug and showed me around the property. He was very proud of the life he'd built out there. His land was more than anyone could actually use. His garden took up less than half an acre, and he had over 20 acres in total. He showed me to my room, a small loft-like space upstairs, with a window that looked out over the front driveway. The house was quiet, and the nearest neighbor was really far away. The first night passed without much happening. We stayed up late talking and had a few drinks on the porch. When it got cold, we moved inside, and then I went to bed at around 1 a.m. I remember waking up at some late hour and heard voices outside. Peering through the small window, I saw a truck parked in front of the house. Its headlights were blasting onto the ground. My brother was outside too. He was arguing with a man who I couldn't quite see. Their voices were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. They were yelling at each other. In the morning, I asked my brother about the late-night visitor, but he shrugged it off, telling me not to worry about it. I probed him a little bit, but then gave up because I didn't want to ruin our visit. He clearly didn't want to get into it. Oren left for work soon after, and I was left alone on the property. He was still working a few days a week in town, while spending the rest of his time in the garden and on other projects. Since he owned his place and grew most of his own food, he didn't need that much money, he told me. By around noon, I decided to explore the woods in the area. There were many trails leading through the hills, so I headed out. As I wandered through the trees, I spotted a truck passing on one of the country roads. I didn't pay much attention at first. There wasn't a lot of traffic out there, but a car or truck would pass occasionally. I couldn't help but think about the truck from the night before, though. Then the truck stopped, and a man got out. He started walking towards the woods quickly. I stopped for a moment and watched. The man stomped through the dense bush, pushing past trees and branches as he came. There wasn't even a trail where he was, but he was coming straight for me. I turned and started walking faster. He was still gaining on me, so I broke into a run. The man shouted after me. He was screaming for me to stop. Not a chance that I was listening to him, though. No matter how hard I ran, he was still gaining on me, and I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. It wasn't long before he caught up to me. The man grabbed my arm and spun me around. I was face to face with him for a second, and he shoved me to the ground. My head almost hit a tree that was just off the path. When I looked up, the man had pulled a knife. I laid there dazed for a while, then he ordered me up to my feet. I got up, then he took a step towards me and said,
"Your brother owes me money. You tell him he's gotta pay."
I tried to explain that I didn't know what he was talking about, but then he took a step forward and raised the knife. I put my hands up in defense, and I told him that I would get it. He let me go with another shove, and then I jogged back to the house. When my brother returned that evening, I confronted him. The anger and fear that I felt were intense, but he just stood there unmoved. I was basically crying with anger that he allowed me to get into that situation. Still, he wouldn't explain what happened. I packed my bags and left that night, driving back home. I didn't talk to my brother for over a year after that. When I told my parents what happened, they were equally furious. To this day, I don't know exactly what Oren was doing up there, but making enemies is never good. I still worry about him, and it was only after some time had passed that I began to forgive him. I was 25 and working for a construction company at the time when this happened. It was a smaller operation owned by my friend's father. I had been with the company for a few years, and a part of my job was to scope out potential projects and sometimes give a rough estimate. My boss would always give the final word, but I would head out to a site and take some pictures, then meet with him to discuss the details. Usually it was a pretty simple job, and I was getting pretty good at it. Because of that, my boss was giving me some more challenging stuff. It was a Thursday, late in the afternoon, when I was heading out to a new possible project. I was driving down a neglected old road. My destination was an old house deep in the woods. The client wanted a quote for its restoration, and my boss didn't know much else. Sometimes you would get out there, and the client had no idea that what they were asking for was literally impossible. I had seen a place once where the client wanted to add a sunroom to a house, where the foundation was literally crumbling. We had to turn down that job. As I pulled up, I saw the house for the first time. It was large, and it had a porch that sagged as if it were about to collapse. Standing on that porch was an older man. He was leaning against a post, his eyes fixed on my truck as I drove up. I parked, grabbed my clipboard and camera, and then walked over. The man straightened up as I walked to him, offering his right hand as a greeting.
"How's it going, buddy? I'm Danny,"
he said. His grip was firm, almost too much so. Danny was at least 60 years old, probably 5'8" with gray hair. He was thin, but still had a big round belly somehow, which almost spilled out from his shirt. I introduced myself, and we got down to business. Danny led me around the exterior first. The house, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, looked more abandoned than anything else. He talked about his plans. He said he'd gotten the place cheap and was ready to invest heavily to bring it back to life. He seemed enthusiastic, but something felt off about him. He avoided certain questions about the house's history. For example, I asked him when it was built, but he didn't know. It seemed strange. Most people would be able to answer that. We moved inside, and the house was in worse shape than I anticipated. The floors felt unsteady beneath my boots, and the musty air was hard to breathe. The wallpaper hung in tattered strips, and the few pieces of furniture were covered in dust and cobwebs. I took pictures, noting mentally how extensive the work would be. The place seemed beyond saving, a thought that I kept to myself. I was ready to wrap up, having seen enough to know that this was a bigger job than we initially thought. However, Danny insisted on showing me the basement. Something about his tone made me hesitate. "I don't need to see the basement, Danny. I've got enough to give you an estimate," I said. In reality, I was pretty sure this place was beyond saving, so that was the real reason I didn't need to see it. He was insistent though, almost desperate.
"You really should see it. It's an important part of the house,"
he urged. I shook my head, taking a step towards the door, but Danny grabbed my arm. His grip was tight and aggressive. I turned sharply, ready to defend myself. Our eyes met for a moment. There was a strange intensity on his face, and as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. He let go of my arm, offering a sheepish smile, as if suddenly embarrassed. Danny was an older guy, and not very large or fit. I was 25 and 6'4", not a bodybuilder by any means, but I worked with my hands and I was reasonably strong. I know I could have taken that guy, but it's best that it didn't come to that. I was ready to start swinging on him, but I was able to control myself before making that mistake. I headed for my truck, and when I got there, I looked back. Danny was standing on the porch with that same fake smile. I thought at the time that he was embarrassed, and hoping I wouldn't tell anyone that he grabbed me. At the moment, I was going to let it go, but on the way back, I thought about it some more. It gave off a really creepy vibe, so I thought it could have been some kind of ambush. At the office the next day, I mentioned the encounter to my boss. I showed him the pictures, and told him that the house was basically beyond repair. As soon as he saw my pictures, he agreed. My boss then told me that Danny had sent him some pictures in advance, but they looked nothing like the ones I had taken. Add that to the list of sketchy things Danny did. They probably weren't even of the same house, my boss told me. Then I told him about Danny himself and the creepy things he had done when we were alone. That doesn't sound right, my boss said, reaching for the phone. I'm gonna call the police just to check this out. I left it at that, focusing on other projects. It wasn't until a couple days later that my boss called me into his office. He had a serious look on his face. He told me the police checked the county records and found out that the house was in fact abandoned. It had been seized by the county years prior. There was no record of anybody named Danny who owned it. That being the case, his intentions must have been bad. The place was obviously not being considered for restoration, so the only reason to bring me out there would be some kind of trap. Maybe he let me go because I'm much bigger than him, and he knew I could put up a fight. It does make me wonder, though, what was in that basement. My parents own a cottage that's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's small with 2 bedrooms and just a ground floor. There's no TV and spotty cell coverage. We do have internet there, but it's not the best, and it can get knocked out by bad weather. I used to go up there with my family at least a few times every year since I was really little, so it was like a second home to me. The only neighbor nearby was a small cottage about half a mile down the road. It belonged to an older couple, and they hardly used it, so we were really isolated up there. One summer when I was in my mid-20s, my parents let me live up there for about 3 months straight. I was between jobs at the time. I had an internship lined up, but until it started, I didn't have anywhere to live, so the cottage was a good place for me to spend that time. I had been there for about a month straight, alone most of the time. One evening, at around dusk, I was in the living room reading a book. It was another quiet night alone out there. It could get kind of lonely, but I loved it most of the time. At around 10 p.m., I got up to go to the bathroom. When I walked past the front window, I saw someone standing on the dirt road in front of the cottage. It was odd, because the area was so remote. I hadn't seen another person in over a week, not even a passing car or truck. I went to the bathroom anyway, and when I came out, I realized that the man hadn't moved. He was just standing there, staring towards the house. It was unsettling, and I tried to go back to my book, but the image of the stranger was hard to ignore. I waited a while, and then got up to check if he was still out there. When I looked out the front window, I found the man was now on my porch. Getting a better look at him, I noticed something disturbing. The man was covered in blood. He didn't knock or call out, just stood there. If he needed help, then I would have thought he would say something, but this guy did none of that. At that point, I was concerned, so I called out to him. "Hey buddy, everything alright?" No answer, not even a flinch. He just stood there with blood running down his face, staring at the front door. Locking all the doors and windows seemed like the right thing to do, so I did it, double-checking each one. Suddenly there was a loud knock at the front door. It was so unexpected that I jumped up from my seat. Without thinking much, I grabbed the gun that we kept at the cottage for safety. I had never thought that I'd need to use it, but there I was, holding it. I had no intention of shooting, but it was better to have it than not. I hoped it would scare the guy off. When I got to the front, I looked out the window again, and the man was now back on the road. I opened the front door slowly and stepped out onto the porch. Then I waved at the man. "Hey, what's going on? Can I call someone for you?" I said, trying to be sympathetic. The man looked like he was hurt, but his behavior was unusual to say the least. I didn't know if he was dangerous, but he was really creepy. When he saw me, though, he started running towards me quickly. I didn't want to shoot, but I was also scared for my life. I rushed back inside and locked the door. The man reached the door in seconds, banging on it furiously. The sound was loud, and he seemed desperate. I felt like he was trying to break it down, but luckily, it was a solid oak door that was original to the old cottage, and it was pretty strong. I called the cops right then. They said it would take them around 45 minutes to get there. I knew the cottage was remote, but 45 minutes seemed like an eternity with that madman trying to break in. I was terrified that he'd get in before they arrived. I was worried he might switch to the window. I tried to stay on the line with the police, but soon after I gave them the address, the call disconnected. I was lucky to get service when I did in order to make that call. It would have been a real nightmare otherwise. The banging on the door eventually stopped. I stayed by the door, not moving, not even daring to breathe too loudly. Every once in a while, I would hear footsteps on the wooden planks that made up our front porch. He was still out there, and he never left. Finally, the police arrived. They took the man away and placed him into the back of one of their cars. He was struggling and flailing wildly as they did so. Once it was safe to come out, I talked to the police. They told me that he was high on something and probably didn't even understand what he was doing. They also told me that there was a truck crashed in a ditch not far away from the cottage, and the police think it belonged to him. That would explain the injuries that I noticed on the man. So some guy got wasted behind the wheel, crashed, then climbed out of the wreckage, only to scare the crap out of me in the middle of nowhere. This is probably the craziest story I have. The chances of some random stranger just ending up there was small. There was literally nothing other than our cottage and our neighbors, so I still have no idea what he was doing on those roads to begin with. This happened a long time ago when I was young, almost 20 years ago now. Every summer, we'd spend a week at my uncle's property. It was a giant area out in a remote part of Wisconsin. It was a kind of paradise to us kids when we were younger. We looked forward to that week all year. For a few days out of the week, my parents, uncle, and cousins would do a camping trip that went through my uncle's property and also onto some of the public land that surrounded it. When I was 12, my cousins and I were allowed to go out there by ourselves. We had been with our parents many times, but it was exciting to go with just the kids. We were planning for 4 days on the trails, a longer trip than usual. My cousins were Jack, who was 16, Luke was 13, and Sarah was 14, so I was the youngest of the group. I was also probably the most immature. Jack, being the oldest, took the lead. He was a natural leader, and since it was his dad's property, he lived there for the whole summer break. He was in the city with his mom for the school year. The first day was fairly normal. We set up camp as the sun was setting. As darkness fell upon the forest, we gathered around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. It was around 10 p.m., and we had been sitting around the fire for about an hour when Jack heard a rustling in the bushes near our campsite. We all fell silent, trying to hear over the crackling of the fire. I didn't hear anything, but Sarah said that she did. Luke wasn't sure. It went on for another 5 minutes when a man emerged and walked over to us by the fire. He introduced himself and said that he was a park ranger. He was a tall guy, rugged-looking, with a beard that looked wild. He didn't seem to wear a uniform, which I thought was weird, but he had a friendly enough demeanor. He said he was just checking in on us, making sure we were safe. Then he said it wasn't usual for a group of kids to come through there alone. We thanked him, and then he left. Once he was out of earshot, Jack whispered to us, "Did you notice that he wasn't wearing a uniform?" I noticed too, and thought it was weird, but I didn't really know what they were supposed to wear, so maybe it was fine. What really scared me, though, was the look on Jack's face. He was scared, which scared me. After that night, we tried to forget the encounter and continued our trip the next day, hiking further into the wilderness. The incident with that supposed park ranger faded from our minds, overshadowed by the beauty of the forest and the thrill of being out on our own. Call us naive if you will, but none of us thought it was a serious concern after sleeping on it. After all, if he was some kind of serial killer, then he could have done whatever he wanted to us that night. Jack led the way again that day. We were on an established trail, but it wasn't one that I was familiar with. Jack seemed to know where he was going though, so I was comfortable with that. We were on public land at this point, and the trail was quite remote. We hadn't seen another person all day. I should mention that our parents set us off with a satellite phone, in case we got lost or were in trouble. The hike wasn't difficult or technical in any way. It was just a flat trail with no climbing. You could have done it in running shoes. The second night, we set up camp a little earlier and took our time getting dinner ready. By the time it was dark, we had the fire going again, but this time, Luke and Sarah decided to go to sleep earlier. Luke was a little out of shape, so he was exhausted, Well, Sarah got a bad sunburn and felt tired because of that. Jack and I went to bed later when the fire was just a few glowing embers. For some reason, I couldn't sleep, so I laid awake for a long time. Jack was asleep next to me when I began hearing voices from outside the tent. I listened closely, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but I was pretty sure it was real. I mustered the courage to peek outside. 2 men stood near the dying fire, talking in a whisper. These men didn't look like the friendly type you might see on a hiking trail. They looked rough, and I thought one of them might be the fake ranger from before. I didn't dare move, fearing any sound might draw their attention. I lay awake the entire night, listening to their occasional whispers and footsteps around the campsite. Eventually it did stop. I peeked out again, and they seemed to be gone. This was around 5 in the morning, so I didn't come out yet. By 6, Jack was awake, so we got up together. When the others got up, I told them what I had seen. They were all sound asleep and had no idea we were visited again. We were all scared, unsure of what to do. That's when I remembered the satellite phone that my uncle had given us for emergencies. Jack pulled it out of his pack and called my uncle, his dad. He explained what I saw. The speaker on the phone was loud enough that I could hear my uncle. He paused for a moment after Jack finished talking. "Listen carefully," my uncle said, his voice serious. "There are no park rangers in that area. You need to pack up and head back immediately. I'll meet you as soon as I can." Deep down, I think we all knew that. Jack especially should have known, but we were naive and ignored the warning signs. We packed up in record time, forgetting the idea of breakfast. We didn't talk too much on the way back. I kept replaying the past nights in my head, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't been awake. After only a few hours, I saw my uncle. He was waiting for us on the trail. He guided us back to his truck, which was about another hour hike. He didn't say a word the whole way back. I thought he was angry with us for being so stupid, but that wasn't it. Years later, my uncle and I had a conversation about what took place on that trip. He didn't say anything because he simply didn't know what happened out there. We all knew the man wasn't a real park ranger, but we still don't know what he was doing. We know that he was following us, but we still don't know why he didn't do anything to us. Maybe he was biding his time and waiting. Maybe we called for help, just in time.